Anyways, this is very interesting to me because we'll talk about it after because I got a few things to discuss on it. So here we go. Let's watch this. Explaining the fourth turning in 4 minutes.
History repeats itself in 80-year blocks called saeculum, but we'll just call them history blocks. Not exactly 80 years. This is history, not math, but roughly the span of a human lifetime, maybe 80 to 90 years. Within these 80-year history blocks, we have 4 turnings of around 20 years each. We usually call them generations. This book calls them turnings. Turnings are sort of like seasons, like spring, summer, fall, winter. Throughout our history, we've had these 80-year blocks, and the 80-year blocks have been remarkably similar to each other. We're in one now. The first turning, the first season, is a high, an upbeat era. The second turning is an awakening, a passionate era. The third turning is an unraveling, a downcast era. And the fourth turning, well, sorry, but fourth turnings suck. The fourth turning is a crisis, an era of upheaval. We're in a fourth turning right now. During a high, the getting is good. We had the most even distribution of wealth during our high. You could work at a gas station and afford to buy a house. This high is the period that the MAGA hats refer to. We got Hank Williams and Elvis and Little Richard and the birth of rock and roll. We launched monkeys and men into space. This is when the Mustangs and Corvettes first came out. Our high ended with the assassination of John F. Kennedy on November 22nd, 1963. The high is not a high for everyone, of course. America still had a segregated South. Homosexuality was illegal and considered a mental disorder. The high is a period of conformity. The age of nonconformity and of social justice begins during the Awakening, our passionate era. During the Awakening, we had Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, acid, Vietnam protests and Vietnam itself, the Women's Liberation Movement, Stonewall and the Gay Rights Movement, great movies, great music. This is when the first Macintosh computer came out. The Awakening is a time of increasing individualism. This second turning, this awakening, ended with the re-election of Ronald Reagan in 1984. Things get messy during the third turning, during the unraveling. We got the fall of Soviet communism and the beginning of the Russian gangster state. The greatest musicians of the time sang about violence and decay in their deteriorating cities. The LA riots, OJ, the bombing of Bosnia, and the Columbine high school shootings on the same day. September 11th, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Our unraveling ended with the financial crisis of 2008. 80 years ago, in the last fourth turning, America had her Great Depression, then World War II. 80 years before that, the Civil War. 80 years before that, the Revolutionary War. Each generation's archetype is the characteristic that will define the generation in its prime, in midlife. The boomer archetype is the prophet. Bill Gates and Steve Jobs are boomers and prophets. Both predicted that one day everyone, not just big corporations and governments, would own a computer. Gates even predicted a crisis like COVID-19 5 years beforehand. The writers of this book are boomers and prophets. Gen X is the nomad generation. The quintessential Gen Xer, Elon Musk, builds things that move us from one place to another. Rockets, electric cars, hyperloops, nomadic devices. But the millennials, raised during the unraveling, will emerge as the hero generation during this crisis. These are the Parkland High students, the frontline hospital workers, and Malala Yousafzai. The book says millennials will be the World War II heroes of our history block. We don't know what Gen Z will do, but they will be an artist generation. From them will emerge the next Bill Withers, Toni Morrison, or Bob Dylan, all born during the last crisis, all from an artist generation. The history block before ours ended with World War II and began with the Civil War, 80 years prior. The history block before that ended with the Civil War and began with the end of the Revolutionary War, 80 years prior. Every 80 years or so, something big comes along and changes everything. And now we're at the end of our history block, right in the middle of our crisis. We are in the process of changing our world again.
Pretty interesting. Yeah, you know what? It was, and I don't want to spend too long on this because we're already 43 minutes here, but I'm horrible at this. To me, when I first got into crypto first, as I'm sure most people here did. And I got into it because it made sense to me that, we live in this very high tech world already. Everybody's using the internet. Wouldn't it make sense to have currency that we can send at the speed of light without really anybody in between there? And I didn't really understand Bitcoin at that point. I didn't understand the decentralization of the Bitcoin network and how people vote with their nodes. I didn't understand that. It wasn't until I started looking at history and the monetary system and the ability to print money and create money, and when the Federal Reserve was created, and the Titanic and the wars and the 1971, the gold standard, how this all happened. It wasn't until I understood history that I could see why Bitcoin is so valuable. And so looking at things like that, to me, a few things come to mind. The first thing is that nothing lasts forever, right? We get very caught up thinking that the way things are today is how they're always going to be. I think that's just human nature, a recency effect. But nothing lasts forever. Everything changes. Everything in life is cycles. The seasons are cycles. Everything at a micro level to a macro level, everything is just a bunch of cycles happening over and over again. The other thing too is that based off of that, we're going from the crisis history block into the high, which I think that you would probably agree with. I agree with. That's starting in 2028. It could be now, though. They're not exactly 20 years. It's not like there's a countdown where we strike the minute into the next history block and all of a sudden everything's great. But I do think that once we get past this bullshit that we're going through right now, it is going to be a very high time for people, Bitcoiners and non-Bitcoiners. I subscribe to the theory that things are just going to slowly get better here over time. The reverse effect of the 1971 gold standard. At that time, nobody really knew what was going on. Nobody knew the impacts of taking us off the gold, or the world essentially off the gold standard when the US did that. Nobody understood the implications of that. We just watched it play out for the next 50 years. And that's where we're at the end of that right now. And I think that Bitcoin's going to have the opposite effect on that, where nobody really, the majority of people have no idea what Bitcoin is, why it's so valuable, and what it's going to solve. But everything's going to get better over the next 50 years. So 2028, the new history block, the new high starts. I like that he called millennials the heroes there. I'm a millennial, so you're welcome. But no, it makes a lot of sense. Oh, there's the alarm. Better shut this door. But it makes a lot of sense to me. And the other thing too that I want to talk about in terms of that is that Bitcoin might change the landscape. It might not, though. And, I get really caught up in what's coming, and I have this vision for the future of what I think it's going to be, but that's not necessarily the case. I think that Bitcoin's going to eventually end wars, because it just doesn't really make sense when you take away the ability for governments to print money, to take on new debt, to buy weapons, to pay for all this bullshit, then it just disappears. And I do think that that's going to happen. So I'm curious to see what kind of impact that Bitcoin's going to have on this, because it's a totally different system here. But here's the thing we have to keep in mind, and I have to keep this in mind too, because I see this future of the high, but then it's always going to stay like that. But we have to keep in mind that these cycles will probably repeat itself over the next 80 years. We'll probably have the high, we'll probably have an awakening, an unraveling, and then a crisis again. That's probably what's going to happen. It might just look differently under a Bitcoin standard. But you have to keep in mind here that forever in life, there's always going to be good and there's always going to be evil. Without a doubt, that's the one guarantee in life, that there's always going to be good and there's always going to be evil. It'll never be, there can't be good without evil. So you have to understand that even if they're unable to manipulate the money, they'll find a different way to do it, to screw things up, I think. As I said, until I saw this, I never really realized that that's a pretty likely scenario, is that, yes, we're going to have 20, 30 years of really good times at the end of this one. But what happens after that? What is the evil of the world going to impose on us that's going to send us into another cycle? Because it's going to happen. It's going to happen without a doubt. So it's important to keep that in mind, I think, just to kind of manage your expectations with everything. A lot of us might be gone in the next 30 years. Hopefully not me, hopefully not you, but some people watching here today will be gone. So the most important part there is that we have some really good times ahead. And I know it's very easy to get caught up in the day-to-day, the news cycle, to bury yourself in that. But just understand that this is going to happen. This is nature. It's cycles. So we're heading into very good time. And if you're a Bitcoiner at this point, as the last thing we talked about there, you're going to be fabulously wealthy. And it's going to be tough for people. It's going to be tough for your friends and your family. But it's still going to be a lot better than it is today. I think that's what we have to keep in mind here.